Garjontola. The final run brought Fakir's boat into shallow water, within a few meters of the shore. Pia's guess had been amply confirmed by this time. Her surroundings showed that there was a kilometer depression in the sheltered crook of the river's elbow. The declivity formed a gentle kidney-shaped basin, with a rounded bottom and sides. Although the drop exceeded 8 meters in some places, on average it was only some 5 meters deeper than the rest of the riverbed. The pool, in short, was similar in most particulars to those frequented by the Orkella of the Mekong during the dry season. With the water running high, the band of mud on the shore had thinned to the width of a few paces, and the mangrove trunks were at last at eye level, neither above nor below the boat. The water was so shallow here that there was no point in taking soundings. For the first time in hours, Pia went off effort, dropping her binoculars and resting her eyes on the greenery of the shore. Presently her gaze was drawn to what seemed to be a fragment of brick lying in the mud. She looked more closely, and her glasses confirmed her impression. This was, indeed, a bit of broken brick, and it was not the only one. The shore was littered with them. Examining the tangled greenery, she discovered that some of the mangroves were grown out of mud walls, while others had chunks of brick entwined in their roots. She called out to Fakir, "Look! There!" He turned to the shore and nodded. "Garjontola," he said, with a gesture in that direction. She guessed that this was the name of whatever settlement had once stood there. "Garjontola?" He nodded in confirmation. She was glad to know the name and noted it quickly. The Dolphins' tidal pool, she decided, would be named after this abandoned village, the Garjontola pool. All of a sudden, Tutul jumped to his feet, rocking the boat. Looking up from her notebook, she saw that he was pointing into the middle distance, to a tree that was taller than the others, more like a birch than a mangrove. It was slender-limbed, with light-colored bark and foliage that seemed almost silvery against the dense, heavy green of the surrounding mangroves. At the end of the run, Fakir surprised her by turning the boat's bow in the direction of the shore. This was the closest she had been to the forest, and she felt as though she were facing it for the first time. Before, it had been either half submerged or a distant silhouette looking down on the water from the heights of the shore. Staring at it now, she was struck by the way the greenery worked to confound the eye. It was not just that it was a barrier, like a screen or a wall. It seemed to trick the human gaze, in the manner of a cleverly drawn optical illusion. There was such profusion of shapes, forms, hues, and textures, that even things that were in plain view seemed to disappear, vanishing into the tangle of lines like the hidden objects in children's puzzles. Fakir pulled the oars in after a last powerful stroke, and the boat's bow nudged into the mud. Then he rose to his feet, and as if by magic his lungi became a loincloth. He transformed by a single flick of his wrist. Swinging his legs over the side, he dropped into the water and gave the boat a push that sent it plowing deep into the bank. Pia, sitting in the bow, found herself lodged halfway up the bank, with a tangled barrier of mangrove blocking off the slope ahead. After lifting Tutul off the boat, Fakir made a beckoning motion with his arm, and she understood that he was asking her to follow him off the boat. But where was he going? She sketched an interrogatory gesture, and he responded by pointing in the direction of the island's interior, past the first barrier of mangrove. "In there?" Now he was beckoning again, motioning to her to hurry. She hesitated for a moment, held back by her aversion to mud, insects, and dense vegetation, all of which were present aplenty on the shore. In any other circumstances, she would not even have considered heading into the forest cover of that kind, but with Fakir, it was different. Somehow she knew she would be safe. Okay, I'm coming. Rolling her pants up to her knees, she swung her bare feet over the gunwale. The mud parted under her weight, sucking her feet in with a wet slurping sound. She was taken completely by surprise, for the mud hadn't seemed deep at all when Fokir was running up the bank. The slight forward momentum of her body as she came off the boat was enough to unbalance her. The grip of the mud pulled her ankles backwards, away from her center of gravity. Suddenly she was tipping over, falling face forwards, extending her arm to keep herself from slamming into the mud. But at just the right moment, Fokir appeared directly in front of her, with his body positioned to block her fall. She landed heavily on his shoulder, and once again she found herself soaking in the salty smell of his skin. In blocking her fall, she had thrown her arms around his torso as though he were a pillar or a tree trunk, and one of her hands had caught hold of his shoulder blade, digging into the recess between muscle and bone. Her other hand had slid down his bare skin, coming to rest on the small of his back, and for an instant she was paralyzed with embarrassment. Then she became aware of Tootle's voice somewhere nearby. He was laughing at her discomfiture in childish delight, and she began to pull away from Fokir, withdrawing her fingers gingerly. When he put a steadying hand under her elbow, she saw he was laughing too, but not in a way that seemed unkind. He seemed to be amused more by her surprise at the depth of the mud than by her fall. After she was on her feet again, he enacted a little pantomime to show her how to negotiate the bank. Lifting up a foot, he curled his big toe like a crab's claw and dug into the mud. She tried it herself, and it worked for a couple of steps, but then her foot slipped again. Fortunately, he was still beside her, and she held on to his arm until they had left the mud behind and pushed their way into the tangle of greenery that lined the shore. She saw now he had a machete with him. He went ahead of her, swinging the blade and clearing a path through the dense foliage. Soon the green barrier came to an end, and they broke through to a grassy clearing dotted with stunted palm trees. Tootle ran ahead to the far side of the clearing and stopped in front of what seemed to be a small shack built on stilts. On approaching closer, she saw it was not a shack at all, but a leaf-thatched altar or shrine. It reminded her distantly of her mother's puja table, except that the images inside didn't represent any of the Hindu gods she was familiar with. There was a large-eyed female figure in a sari, and beside it, a slightly smaller figure of a man. Crouching between them was a tiger, recognizable because of its painted stripes. Pia stood by and watched as Fokir and Tutul performed a little ceremony. First they fetched some leaves and flowers and placed them in front of the images. Then, standing before the shrine, Fokir began to recite some kind of chant with his head bowed and his hands joined in an attitude of prayer. After she had listened for a few minutes, Pia recognized a refrain that occurred over and over again. It contained a word that sounded like Allah. She had not thought to speculate about Fakir's religion, but it occurred to her now that he might be Muslim. But sooner had she thought this than it struck her that a Muslim was hardly likely to pray to an image like this one. What Fakir was performing looked very much like her mother's Hindu pujas, and yet the words seemed to suggest otherwise. But what did it matter either way? She was glad just to be there, as a witness to this strange little ritual. A few minutes later they headed back, and on breaking free of the mangrove, Pia saw that the sun had dipped in the sky and the level of the water had begun to fall. She tiptoed carefully across the mud and was about to climb into the boat when Fakir waved to catch her attention. He was 20 meters away, kneeling with his hand pointing toward the ground. Pia went over to look and saw that he was pointing to a depression in the mud filled with scurrying crabs. She raised her eyebrows, and he held up a hand as if to tell her that was what it was, the mark of a hand. She frowned in comprehension. What hand could have touched that mud other than his? Then it struck her that maybe he meant not hand but foot or paw. Tiger? She was about to say, but he raised a finger to prevent her. She understood now that this was indeed some kind of superstition. To say that word, or even to make a gesture of reference to it, was taboo. She looked at it again and could see nothing to suggest that it was what he had said. The placement of the mark contributed to her skepticism. The animal would have had to be in full view and she would have seen it from the water. And would Fakir himself be quite so unconcerned if there really was a tiger nearby? It just didn't add up. Then she heard the sound of an exhalation, and all thought of the tiger was banished from her mind. Picking up her binoculars, she spotted two humps breaking the river's surface. It was the adult orchella swimming in tandem with the calf. With the water ebbing, the dolphins had returned. Their movements seemed to follow exactly the pattern she had inferred.